The pen slipped from Rebecca Hayes' fingers, clattering onto the worn linoleum floor of Clearwater Public Library. At 34, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Cardigan buttoned to the neck, reading glasses perched halfway down her nose, brown hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for the past 8 years. Behind the circulation desk, she froze as the heavy footsteps of military boots echoed through the quiet afternoon stillness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sergeant Major David Torres swept through the library's entrance like a storm front, his desert camouflage uniform a stark contrast to the faded beige walls lined with romance novels and local history collections. 3 Marines flanked him: Corporal Martinez, Staff Sergeant Johnson, and Private Wilson, their presence transforming the peaceful sanctuary into something that felt more like a briefing room. "I need to speak with whoever runs your tactical training resources," Torres announced, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere like a blade. His steel-gray eyes scanned the small space with obvious disappointment. "Command sent me here based on your facility's advertised marksmanship consultation services." Rebecca's pulse quickened. 8 years of careful anonymity suddenly felt as fragile as the antique card catalogs gathering dust in the basement. Her colleagues, Jennifer from Reference, Mark from Children's Services, and Sarah from Interlibrary Loans, suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. The familiar weight of being overlooked settled on her shoulders, but today it felt different, heavier. Library Director Nancy Williams emerged from her cramped office, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses with nervous precision. Her smile was the practiced one she reserved for difficult patrons and budget meetings. "Sergeant Major Torres, I apologize for any confusion. Our catalog system might have some outdated classifications. Perhaps I can help you locate whatever educational materials you're seeking." Torres pulled out a printed email, his jaw tightening with each word he read. "Your online database specifically lists advanced marksmanship theory and application under specialized military resources. I've got 12 Marines preparing for sniper qualification next month, and we need expert consultation on precision shooting techniques." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca could hear the ancient heating system cycling on, the distant hum of the copy machine, even the soft tick of the wall clock that had been counting down the minutes of her quiet life for nearly a decade. Nancy's face flushed pink as the reality of the situation became clear. "I'm terribly sorry," Nancy stammered, wringing her hands. "There must be some database error. We're a small-town library. We have hunting magazines and some basic firearm safety pamphlets, but nothing that would qualify as expert military consultation." Corporal Martinez stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "Ma'am, our intel was very specific. Someone at this facility has credentials in advanced marksmanship training. We don't drive 4 hours from Camp Henderson for hunting magazines." Rebecca felt her throat constrict. She knew exactly how that database entry had appeared. 3 years ago, during a particularly quiet winter, she'd been updating the library's digital catalog and had absent-mindedly classified some of her personal reference materials alongside the official collection. Materials she should have destroyed years ago, but couldn't bring herself to discard. "There's been a mistake," Nancy repeated, her voice growing more strained. "We're just a public library. Romance novels, children's story time, computer classes for seniors. Nothing military." Staff Sergeant Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Story time and romance novels, perfect training for precision shooting under combat conditions. His sarcasm hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Rebecca's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the circulation desk. These weren't just any hands. Despite 8 years of stamp pads and paper cuts, her fingers still maintained the steady strength that had once made her reputation. Her nails were kept short not for typing efficiency but from muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. The database entry they'd found was real. Hidden among legitimate library resources were her personal notes on wind calculation, breathing techniques, and scope adjustment protocols. Advanced materials that had no business existing in a small-town library, classified by someone who had no business knowing such things. At least, not anymore. "I can help you," Rebecca said quietly. The words escaped before she could stop them, cutting through the tense conversation like a gunshot in the wilderness. Every person in the library turned to stare at the mousy librarian, who never volunteered for anything more challenging than organizing the book sale. Jennifer's mouth fell open. Mark's book cart stopped mid-roll, its squeaky wheels suddenly silent. Sarah gripped her armload of returned books so tightly her knuckles went white. Nancy looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Torres studied Rebecca with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats and assets. "You can help with advanced marksmanship training?" Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "The materials you're looking for do exist. I can provide consultation on precision shooting techniques, environmental factors, and equipment optimization." Private Wilson snorted with derision. "Look at her, Sergeant Major. She probably thinks a trigger is something on a camera. I bet she's never even held a real weapon." The mockery stung, but not because it was cruel. It stung because it was exactly the reaction Rebecca had cultivated for 8 years. She had worked hard to become invisible, unremarkable, safe. But safety, she was beginning to realize, had come at the cost of authenticity. "The M40A6 sniper rifle you're probably training with has a maximum effective range of 1,000 meters, Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger despite the doubt radiating from the Marines. "But in practical field conditions, environmental factors reduce that to about 800 meters for consistent precision shots. Your biggest challenges won't be equipment limitations. They'll be wind drift calculation and breathing control under stress." The room fell completely silent. Torres stopped mid-gesture, his hand halfway to his notepad. Even the librarian stared at Rebecca as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Those specifications aren't common knowledge," Torres said slowly. "Where exactly did you learn about military sniper systems?" Rebecca felt the familiar chill of exposure creeping up her spine. For 8 years, she'd lived in carefully constructed obscurity, but technical knowledge had a way of revealing itself. Like muscle memory, expertise couldn't be completely suppressed. "I read extensively," she replied, the explanation sounding weak even to her own ears. "Military journals, tactical publications, I stay current with firearms technology." Corporal Martinez exchanged glances with Johnson. "Ma'am, the M40A6 specifications you just cited aren't published in civilian magazines. That's specialized information from military training manuals." The trap was closing around her, built from her own inability to watch trained soldiers struggle with problems she could solve. Rebecca had learned to hide her knowledge, but she'd never learned to ignore genuine need when she saw it. Nancy stepped forward, her face pale with worry. "Rebecca, return to your duties. I'll handle our guests." Her tone carried an edge of panic. In a small town, the library's reputation was everything. Offending military personnel could mean disaster for their already stretched budget. But Torres raised his hand, stopping Nancy's intervention. His expression had shifted from skepticism to intense curiosity. "Actually, I'd like to hear more. If you really understand advanced marksmanship, prove it." The challenge hung in the air between them. Rebecca looked at her colleagues. Jennifer's frightened eyes, Mark's confused expression, Sarah's obvious disapproval. They saw her as the quiet woman who processed book returns and helped with research questions. They had no context for what she was revealing about herself. "The biggest mistake most shooters make," Rebecca said, committing fully to a path she couldn't retreat from, "is focusing too much on equipment and not enough on fundamentals. You can have the most expensive rifle and scope system available, but if you can't control your breathing and calculate wind drift accurately, you'll miss your target every time." Torres leaned forward, genuinely interested now. "Go on. Wind is everything beyond 300 meters. Most training programs teach basic wind reading, but they don't account for terrain effects. A valley can create wind tunnels that completely change bullet trajectory. A hill can create thermal updrafts that affect shots at different times of day. Real precision shooting means understanding the environment as much as understanding your weapon." Private Wilson had stopped smirking. Staff Sergeant Johnson was taking notes. Corporal Martinez nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're talking about advanced environmental ballistics," Martinez said. "That's not basic firearms knowledge. That's specialized sniper training." Rebecca realized she had revealed too much, too quickly. But 8 years of watching people underestimate her capabilities had built up like pressure in a sealed container. The release was both terrifying and liberating. "I may work in a library," she said quietly, "but that doesn't mean I don't understand precision shooting." Torres studied her for a long moment, his tactical mind clearly processing this unexpected development. "Tomorrow morning. 0800 hours, Henderson Shooting Range. If you really know what you're talking about, show us. As the Marines filed out of the library, Rebecca felt the weight of every stare from her colleagues. She had shattered 8 years of careful invisibility in less than 10 minutes. There was no going back to being the quiet librarian who kept her head down and processed book returns. Nancy approached the circulation desk, her expression unreadable. "Rebecca, we need to talk. My office. Now." Rebecca followed her supervisor into the cramped space filled with budget reports and community event flyers. Nancy closed the door and turned to face her, hands on her hips. 8 years, Nancy said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. 8 years you've worked here, and you never mentioned having military expertise? Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I don't have military expertise," Rebecca replied carefully. "I have knowledge about marksmanship." Knowledge that apparently includes classified military specifications. Nancy's voice rose with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? What if you're wrong? What if you can't back up these claims? The military doesn't forget embarrassment, Rebecca. If you fail tomorrow, it reflects on this entire institution." Rebecca understood Nancy's fear. In small towns, reputation was currency, and the library operated on a tight budget that depended heavily on community support and grants. A public failure would have consequences far beyond Rebecca's personal embarrassment. "I won't fail," Rebecca said quietly. "How can you be so confident?" Nancy demanded. "Where did this knowledge come from? Who are you, really?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Rebecca looked at the familiar office walls, covered with photos of library events and community achievements. For 8 years, this place had been her refuge, her sanctuary from a past she'd worked hard to leave behind. But sanctuary, she was beginning to understand, was just another word for prison when it kept you from being who you really were. "I'm someone who's very good at what I do," Rebecca said finally, "and tomorrow they're going to find out just how good." As she left Nancy's office and returned to the circulation desk, Rebecca felt the curious stares of her colleagues following her every movement. The quiet librarian they thought they knew was gone, replaced by someone none of them recognized. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Colorado. "Saw the news about increased military training at Camp Henderson. Hope it doesn't affect your quiet little town." Rebecca stared at the message, realizing that quiet was the last thing her life was about to become. Tomorrow morning would change everything, either validating her hidden expertise or destroying the careful life she'd built in Clearwater. But as she mechanically processed returned books and answered routine reference questions, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years: anticipation. For the first time since arriving in this small town, she would have the chance to be truly herself. The question was whether anyone, including herself, was ready for that revelation. Rebecca's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., though she'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of her modest apartment on Elm Street. The weight of what she'd committed to pressed down on her chest like a physical force. 8 years of careful anonymity were about to be shattered by 15 rounds of ammunition and the scrutiny of trained Marines. She dressed methodically: dark jeans, plain black t-shirt, hiking boots. No cardigan today, no reading glasses to hide behind. For the first time in nearly a decade, Rebecca Hayes was preparing to be exactly who she used to be. The drive to Henderson Shooting Range took 23 minutes through winding country roads lined with oak trees that had witnessed generations of secrets. Rebecca's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but her mind raced through calculations she hadn't needed to make in years. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, variables that would determine whether today ended in vindication or humiliation. Henderson Shooting Range sprawled across 40 acres of former farmland, its utilitarian buildings and covered firing positions, a stark contrast to the peaceful countryside. Rebecca parked beside a convoy of military vehicles, their desert camouflage paint jobs still dusty from yesterday's training exercises. Sergeant Major Torres stood near the main building, consulting with a tall woman in civilian clothes whose confident posture screamed military even without the uniform. Rebecca recognized the type immediately: career soldier transitioning to private contractor, probably former Special Forces. "Dr. Rebecca Hayes?" The woman extended a firm handshake. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, retired. I run advanced marksmanship training for military contractors. Sergeant Major Torres asked me to observe today's demonstration. Rebecca's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about proving herself to the Marines anymore. They'd brought in an expert to evaluate her claims. Someone who would recognize real expertise, or expose her as a fraud within minutes. "I'm not a doctor," Rebecca replied quietly. "Just a librarian with some knowledge about shooting." Mitchell's smile was sharp as a blade. "We'll see about that." "Torres tells me you made some interesting claims about environmental ballistics yesterday. Claims that would require extensive training to substantiate." The group moved toward the rifle range, a covered facility with shooting positions extending out to 800 meters. Rebecca noted the wind flags spaced at regular intervals, the spotting scopes mounted at each position, the professional-grade equipment that spoke of serious marksmanship training. Torres gathered his Marines, Martinez, Johnson, and Wilson, plus 3 additional shooters Rebecca hadn't met the day before, Corporals Bradley and Thompson, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, 6 trained military marksmen, all watching her with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright amusement. "Standard demonstration protocol," Torres announced. 15 rounds, 300-meter targets, prone position. We'll start there and see what happens." Rebecca studied the targets through the provided spotting scope. Standard military silhouettes, black on white, positioned on a range that showed clear signs of professional maintenance. Wind flags indicated a consistent crosswind from the southwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. "What rifle system?" she asked. "Your choice," Mitchell replied, gesturing toward a rack of weapons. "We've got M4 0A5s, Remington 700s, and a few civilian precision rifles. Take your pick." Rebecca examined the available rifles with the methodical attention of someone who understood that equipment selection was crucial to performance. She selected an M4 0A5, not because it was the most advanced option, but because she knew its characteristics intimately. Muscle memory from another life guided her hands as she checked the scope mounting, tested the bolt action, and verified the trigger pull. "Interesting choice," Mitchell observed. "Most civilian shooters would go for the newer systems." "The M4 0A5 is reliable," Rebecca replied, settling into the prone position behind the rifle. "I prefer reliability over innovation." She began the ritual that had once been as natural as breathing. Check the scope settings, calculate wind drift, control breathing, find the natural point of aim. The familiar weight of the rifle, the feel of the stock against her shoulder, the precise pressure required on the trigger. It all came flooding back as if 8 years had been 8 minutes. The first shot broke cleanly, the rifle's recoil absorbed by proper body position. Through the scope, Rebecca watched the spotting disc appear in the target's center ring. Dead center. Wilson snorted. "Lucky shot." Rebecca didn't respond. She was already calculating the next shot, adjusting for a slight shift in wind direction indicated by the flags downrange. The second shot followed the first into the center ring. By the 5th shot, the Marines had stopped talking. By the 10th shot, Mitchell was taking notes. All 15 rounds grouped within a 3-inch circle at the target's center, performance that would have been respectable for a trained military sniper, let alone a small-town librarian. Torres lowered his binoculars, his expression unreadable. Impressive shooting, but 300 meters isn't exactly extreme range. "No," Rebecca agreed, standing and brushing dust from her jeans. "It's not." Mitchell stepped forward, her demeanor noticeably more respectful. "Where did you train? That level of consistency doesn't happen by accident." The question Rebecca had been dreading since yesterday. She could deflect, make vague references to civilian training courses and weekend shooting clubs. But the performance she'd just demonstrated would make those explanations laughable. "Various places," she said carefully, "over several years." "Military various places or civilian various places?" Mitchell pressed. Before Rebecca could answer, Torres interrupted. "Let's move to 500 meters. See if the performance holds up at extended range." The longer distance required different calculations, more precise wind reading, greater attention to environmental factors. Rebecca studied the range through binoculars, noting how the terrain created subtle air currents that would affect bullet trajectory. "Wind's tricky at that distance," she said, more to herself than to the watching Marines. "There's a depression about halfway to the targets that's going to create some unpredictable air movement." Martinez looked surprised. "How can you tell that from here?" Rebecca pointed to a flag positioned at the 250-meter mark. See how that flag is moving differently from the others? That indicates changing air pressure, probably caused by terrain features. The bullet's going to hit that turbulence about halfway through its flight path. She made her scope adjustments, calculating holdover for the increased distance and windage for the complex air currents. The first shot at 500 meters struck just outside the center ring, still an excellent shot, but not the perfection of the shorter distance. Compensating for the air pocket, Rebecca muttered, making a slight adjustment. The second shot found the center ring, the third, the fourth. 15 shots later, she had produced another group that would have impressed professional instructors. The Marines stood in respectful silence, the jokes and skepticism of the previous day completely absent. Mitchell approached, her notebook filled with observations. That's not casual shooting, that's not even advanced recreational shooting, that's precision marksmanship at a level that requires thousands of hours of training. Rebecca remained silent, unsure how to explain expertise she wasn't supposed to possess. The way you read the wind, the adjustments you made, the consistency of your shooting position, Mitchell continued. I've trained military snipers for 15 years. I know what professional technique looks like. Torres stepped closer, his voice lowered, but still carrying the authority of command. Ms. Hayes, I need to ask you directly, do you have military training? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected. Rebecca looked at the faces surrounding her. Marines who had gone from mockery to respect in the span of an hour, a former captain who recognized skills that couldn't be faked, all waiting for an explanation that would make sense of what they'd witnessed. I have training, she said finally. Extensive training. What kind of training? Torres asked. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of secrets she'd carried for 8 years. The careful story she'd constructed about her past. The lies of omission that had allowed her to disappear into small-town anonymity. All of it was crumbling under the weight of 15 perfect shots. The kind of training you don't advertise on a resume, she replied. Wilson, who had been the most skeptical the day before, spoke up with genuine curiosity. Ma'am, with respect, how does someone with your level of shooting ability end up working in a library? The question pierced straight to the heart of Rebecca's carefully constructed life. How did someone go from precision shooting that impressed military professionals to stamping due dates on romance novels? How did expertise that required years to develop end up hidden behind circulation desks and computer terminals? Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, Rebecca said quietly. Mitchell wasn't satisfied with evasive answers. This level of marksmanship doesn't just happen. You didn't learn this at weekend shooting courses. You didn't develop this consistency from reading magazines. Someone trained you, professionally and extensively. The truth was demanding to be told, but Rebecca wasn't ready. Not here, not surrounded by Marines who would have questions she couldn't answer without revealing more than she was prepared to share. Does it matter where I learned? She asked. What matters is whether I can help with your training problem. Torres considered this. You're right. The question is whether you can teach what you obviously know. Can you take 12 Marines and improve their marksmanship scores? Yes, Rebecca replied without hesitation, but not here, not with standard range training. If you want real improvement, you need to train the way you'll actually shoot in the field. Meaning what? Meaning unknown distances, challenging positions, time pressure, environmental stress. Range shooting and field shooting are completely different skills. Mitchell nodded approvingly. She's right about that. Most military marksmanship training is too sterile. Soldiers learn to shoot well on ranges, then struggle in real conditions. Torres made a decision. 3 days. I'll give you 3 days to prove you can train Marines to shoot better than they currently do. If you succeed, we'll discuss a more formal arrangement. As the group prepared to leave the range, Rebecca felt the weight of commitment settling on her shoulders. She had proven she could shoot. Now she had to prove she could teach, which would require revealing even more of the expertise she'd spent 8 years hiding. Mitchell approached as Rebecca secured the rifle she'd used. One more question. That shooting position you used, the way you controlled recoil, the consistency of your breathing pattern. That's not civilian technique. That's military precision shooting, probably special operations level. Rebecca met her gaze steadily. Like I said, I've had extensive training. From whom? From people who knew what they were doing. Mitchell smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was. Fair enough. But Rebecca, Whatever your background, whatever reasons you have for keeping it quiet, that was exceptional shooting. Don't let whoever trained you think their investment was wasted. As Rebecca drove back toward Clearwater, she realized that her quiet life was officially over. 3 days to train Marines meant 3 days of revealing more expertise, answering more questions, exposing more of the past she'd worked so hard to leave behind. But for the first time in 8 years, she felt truly alive. The rifle had felt right in her hands. The calculations had come naturally. The satisfaction of perfect shots had reminded her of who she used to be and who she might be able to become again. The quiet librarian was gone. What remained to be seen was whether Rebecca Hayes was ready to be someone else entirely. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m., 2 days after Rebecca's demonstration at Henderson Range. Nancy Williams's voice carried a tension that made Rebecca's coffee taste bitter before she'd even taken a sip. "Rebecca, we need to discuss your situation. The library board met last night. There are concerns." Rebecca stared out her kitchen window at the peaceful morning streets of Clearwater, knowing that peace was about to be shattered. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that involves federal background checks and questions about employee verification procedures. Apparently, word has gotten out about your military consultation work. Some board members are wondering what else we don't know about our staff." The hammer was falling exactly as Rebecca had feared. Small towns thrived on knowing everyone's business, and suddenly the quiet librarian had become a mystery that demanded solving. "I'll be in early today," Rebecca said. "We can talk then." "Actually, don't. Take the day off. Use it wisely." The line went dead, leaving Rebecca alone with the implications. Use it wisely was Nancy's code for figure out how to explain yourself before this gets worse. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Training starts 09:00 at Henderson. Come prepared for field conditions." Torres. Field conditions. That meant leaving the controlled environment of the shooting range for something more challenging. Something that would push both her teaching abilities and her carefully guarded secrets to their limits. Rebecca changed into hiking boots, tactical pants, and a moisture-wicking shirt, clothing that would have looked suspicious in the library but felt natural for what lay ahead. She grabbed her old field notebook from a lockbox in her bedroom closet, its pages filled with observations and techniques she hadn't referenced in 8 years. Henderson's shooting range looked different in the early morning light. Instead of the organized lanes and covered positions, Rebecca found Torres and his Marines gathered around military vehicles loaded with equipment. Captain Mitchell stood beside a large terrain map, marking locations with a red pen. "Change of plans," Torres announced as Rebecca approached. "We're taking this training to Miller's Canyon, about 15 miles north of here. Varied terrain, unknown distances, realistic field conditions." Rebecca studied the map, recognizing immediately why Torres had chosen this location. Miller's Canyon offered everything a marksmanship instructor could want: elevation changes, natural obstacles, varying sight lines, and environmental challenges that would test every aspect of shooting skill. "How many students?" she asked. 12 Marines, all currently struggling with advanced marksmanship qualification. Their scores are acceptable for basic requirements, but not good enough for the specialized roles they're being considered for. Mitchell added, "These aren't beginners. They've all had standard military marksmanship training. What they need is the kind of advanced instruction that takes good shooters and makes them exceptional." Rebecca nodded, understanding the challenge. Teaching fundamentals to beginners was straightforward. Improving the performance of already trained shooters required identifying specific weaknesses and addressing habits that had been reinforced through repetition. The convoy of vehicles wound through countryside that gradually became more rugged, eventually arriving at a valley surrounded by rolling hills and scattered stands of timber. Rebecca could see immediately why this location would challenge even experienced shooters. The terrain created wind patterns that would shift constantly, and the natural features provided both cover and obstacles. "First lesson," Rebecca announced as the Marines gathered their equipment. "Forget everything you think you know about shooting positions. Range shooting and field shooting are completely different skills." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with 20 years of service, looked skeptical. "Ma'am, we've all qualified expert marksmen. We know about shooting positions." "You know about range shooting positions," Rebecca corrected. "In the field, you shoot from whatever position the terrain and situation dictate. Sometimes that's prone behind solid cover. Sometimes it's kneeling behind a rock. Sometimes it's standing in a doorway with a time limit and people shooting back. She led the group to a natural depression surrounded by scattered boulders. For the next 3 hours, we're going to work on unconventional positions. You'll discover muscles you didn't know you had, and you'll learn why comfort and accuracy don't always go together. Rebecca demonstrated a shooting position she called supported standing, using the natural contours of a boulder to create a stable platform while remaining mobile. The position looked awkward, but she consistently hit targets at 400 meters while maintaining the ability to quickly change position. Corporal Bradley attempted to duplicate her stance and immediately struggled with balance. This doesn't feel natural. It's not supposed to feel natural, Rebecca replied. It's supposed to be effective. Natural is what gets you killed when the other guy has better cover than you do. For the next hour, she worked individually with each Marine, adjusting their body position, explaining how to use terrain features for support, and demonstrating breathing techniques that worked in stressful positions. Her teaching style was direct but patient, focusing on the specific improvements each shooter needed rather than generic instruction. Private Wilson, who had been most skeptical during their first library encounter, proved to be her most attentive student. "Ma'am, how do you compensate for the different muscle tension in these positions? I keep pulling my shots left." Rebecca was impressed by the quality of his question. "You're anticipating recoil differently because your body position has changed your natural point of aim. Try this adjustment." She guided him through a subtle shift in his stance that immediately improved his shot placement. Wilson's next 5 rounds grouped tightly around the target center. "Outstanding improvement," Rebecca said, meaning it. Wilson beamed with the satisfaction of breakthrough understanding. As the morning progressed, Rebecca found herself settling into a teaching rhythm she'd forgotten she possessed. Each Marine presented different challenges. Rodriguez had excellent fundamentals but struggled with distance estimation. Martinez was solid at known distances but faltered when ranges were unknown. Johnson had great natural shooting ability but lacked the patience for precise wind reading. "Distance estimation drill," Rebecca announced after lunch. "I've placed targets throughout this valley at unknown ranges. Your job is to estimate distance, calculate holdover, read environmental conditions, and make first-round hits." The Marines spread out across the terrain, each taking a different target. Rebecca moved between them, observing their problem-solving approaches, offering guidance when they struggled, celebrating successes when they achieved breakthrough moments. Thompson called out from a position behind fallen logs. "Target at approximately 450 meters, crosswind left to right, maybe 6 miles per hour. Adjusting 2 minutes right, 1 minute up." His shot struck the target just outside the center ring. Close, but not perfect. "Good calculation," Rebecca said, studying the target through binoculars. "But you missed something. Look at the vegetation between you and the target." Thompson examined the sightline more carefully. "There's a small ridge about halfway to the target, creating an updraft." "Exactly. The bullet's going to rise slightly as it passes through that thermal current. Try the same windage but half the elevation adjustment." His next shot found the center ring. Thompson grinned with the satisfaction of understanding a complex environmental factor. As the afternoon progressed, Rebecca watched the Marines' confidence grow. More importantly, she watched their shooting improve measurably. The combination of challenging positions, unknown distances, and environmental problem-solving was pushing them beyond their comfort zones in exactly the right way. Captain Mitchell observed from various positions, taking notes and occasionally asking Rebecca questions about her teaching methodology. "Where did you learn these instructional techniques?" she asked during a brief break. "Trial and error," Rebecca replied, "and some very good teachers along the way." "Military teachers?" Rebecca focused on adjusting a scope for one of the Marines rather than answering directly, but Mitchell was persistent. "Rebecca, I've been doing this for 15 years. I can recognize military instruction methods when I see them. The way you break down complex skills, the progression from basic to advanced concepts, the individual attention to specific weaknesses, that's not civilian shooting instruction. That's professional military training methodology." Before Rebecca could respond, Sergeant Major Torres approached with a satisfied expression. "Outstanding work today. I've never seen this group of Marines improve this quickly. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Rebecca felt a familiar flush of professional satisfaction. Teaching had always been one of her strengths, even when she'd been reluctant to admit it. "They're good students," she said. "They just needed to be challenged in the right ways." "What's tomorrow's plan?" Torres asked. Rebecca had been thinking about this all afternoon. Moving targets. It's one thing to hit stationary targets at unknown distances. It's completely different to hit targets that are moving, especially when you're also moving. Mitchell's eyebrows rose. Moving target instruction is an advanced curriculum. Most military marksmanship programs don't cover that until specialized sniper courses. "These Marines deserve the best training available," Rebecca replied. "If they're going to be put in situations where lives depend on their shooting ability, they should have every possible advantage." As the group prepared to return to base, Corporal Martinez approached Rebecca with a question that made her stomach clench. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about some of the techniques you've shown us today, the way you read terrain, the environmental calculations, the teaching methods. I've seen instruction like this before, but only in one place." Rebecca waited, knowing what was coming. "I did a rotation at Fort Bragg 3 years ago. Special Forces Training Pipeline. The marksmanship instructors there use the same methodologies you're using, the same progression, the same attention to individual weaknesses, even some of the same terminology." The careful wall Rebecca had built around her past was developing cracks. She could deflect Martinez's observation, change the subject, redirect attention elsewhere, but the Marines deserved honest answers about who was training them. "Good instructors share similar methods," she said carefully. "Effective teaching techniques tend to be consistent regardless of where you encounter them." Martinez nodded, but his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure that's it." As Rebecca drove back toward Clearwater, she realized that tomorrow's training would bring even more scrutiny. Moving target instruction would require demonstrating skills that were even more specialized, more clearly identifiable as professional military expertise. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Nancy Williams and a text message. "Board meeting tonight at 7 p.m. Your employment status is on the agenda. Please attend." Rebecca stared at the message, understanding that her two worlds were about to collide in a way that would force her to choose between the quiet safety she'd built and the authentic expertise she was rediscovering. For 8 years, she'd successfully hidden who she used to be. Now, with each perfect shot and each breakthrough teaching moment, that hidden identity was fighting to emerge. Tomorrow would bring moving targets and more questions. Tonight would bring a library board that wanted answers she wasn't sure she was ready to give. The quiet librarian's secret was becoming impossible to maintain, and Rebecca was beginning to wonder if she even wanted to keep trying. The Clearwater Public Library board meeting convened at exactly 7 p.m. in the cramped conference room behind the main circulation area. Rebecca sat in the single chair facing a semicircle of 5 board members, feeling like a defendant at trial. The familiar smell of old books and floor polish now seemed oppressive rather than comforting. Board Chairman Robert Kellerman, a retired bank president with silver hair and suspicious eyes, opened with the directness of someone accustomed to unpleasant conversations. "Ms. Hayes, we've received some disturbing information about your recent activities, specifically your involvement with military personnel and claims of expertise that were never disclosed during your hiring process." Rebecca kept her hands folded in her lap, projecting calm she didn't feel. "I've been assisting the Marines with some research questions. That's within the scope of my job responsibilities." "Research questions don't typically involve weapons demonstrations at military firing ranges," interjected Margaret Foster, the board secretary and owner of Clearwater's largest real estate agency. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who trafficked in community reputation. The room fell silent. Rebecca realized that word of her shooting demonstration had spread faster than she'd anticipated. In a town of 8,000 people, secrets didn't stay secret for long. "How did you learn about the demonstration?" Rebecca asked. "My nephew works maintenance at Henderson Range," Foster replied. "He mentioned that some librarian had impressed a bunch of Marines with expert-level shooting. Imagine our surprise when we realized he was talking about our children's programming coordinator." Board member Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a retired school superintendent, leaned forward with clinical interest. "Ms. Hayes, your employment application states that your previous work experience consists of library positions in North Carolina. There's no mention of military service or firearms training. Can you explain this discrepancy?" The trap was closing exactly as Rebecca had feared. She could continue deflecting, but these were intelligent people who wouldn't be satisfied with vague answers. They deserved some version of the truth, even if she couldn't reveal everything. I do have experience with firearms, Rebecca said carefully. It wasn't relevant to my library position, so I didn't include it on my application. Not relevant? Kellerman's voice rose with indignation. You're working with children, Miss Hayes. Parents trust us to thoroughly vet everyone who interacts with their kids. Hidden military backgrounds and weapons expertise seem highly relevant to that trust. I don't have a military background, Rebecca replied, which was technically true. Her training had come through civilian contractors, not direct military service. Foster consulted a folder thick with printed pages. We've done some research of our own. Rebecca Hayes, age 34, previous employment at Raleigh Public Library and Charlotte Mecklenburg Library System. But here's the interesting part. There's almost no digital footprint for you before 2016. No social media, no credit history, no education records we can verify. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She'd been careful about constructing her post-North Carolina identity. But careful enough to fool professional investigators was apparently different from careful enough to fool suspicious small-town board members. I value my privacy, she said. Privacy is one thing, Dr. Hoffman interjected, but what we're seeing suggests deliberate identity obscuration, the kind of thing that makes institutional liability lawyers very nervous. Before Rebecca could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent text from Torres. Emergency at base, need you here ASAP, training exercise gone wrong. Rebecca stared at the message, torn between the immediate crisis facing her livelihood and what sounded like a genuine emergency requiring her expertise. I need to leave, she said, standing. Kellerman's face reddened. Miss Hayes, this meeting isn't over. We have serious questions that require answers. People may be hurt, Rebecca replied, heading for the door. Your questions will have to wait. As she drove toward Camp Henderson, Rebecca's phone rang with a call from Captain Mitchell. Thank God you're coming, Mitchell said without preamble. We have a situation. Training accident during a night exercise. One of the Marines from your class was injured, and the incident has raised questions about our training protocols. What kind of questions? The kind that involve investigators asking where our civilian marksmanship consultant got her qualifications. Rebecca, I need to know, are you going to be able to explain your background to military investigators? The question hung in the air as Rebecca navigated the dark roads toward base. Military investigators would have resources that small-town board members couldn't access. They would dig deeper, ask harder questions, demand documentation she couldn't provide. How serious is the injury? Rebecca asked, deflecting. Corporal Martinez took shrapnel from a ricocheted round during the night movement exercise. He's stable, but there's going to be a full investigation. Your training methods are going to be scrutinized. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Martinez, the observant Marine who had already connected her techniques to Fort Bragg training. If he was injured during an exercise that involved methods she'd taught, the investigation would focus directly on her qualifications and background. Camp Henderson buzzed with the controlled chaos of a serious incident response. Rebecca found Torres in the command post, his face grim as he coordinated with medical personnel and investigators. What happened? Rebecca asked immediately. Night movement exercise. Using the techniques you taught yesterday. Martinez was engaging a moving target when his round ricocheted off a rock formation and sent shrapnel back at his position. Caught him in the shoulder and arm. Rebecca felt a chill of professional dread. Ricochet incidents were rare but catastrophic when they occurred. Every marksmanship instructor's nightmare was an accident that could have been prevented with better planning or safety protocols. Was he using the supported standing position I demonstrated? Yes, but that's not the issue. The issue is that Major Blackwood from Base Safety is asking why we're using training methods developed by someone whose credentials can't be verified. As if summoned by his name, Major Blackwood approached a lean man with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to investigating problems that couldn't be explained away. Ms. Hayes, I need to speak with you about the training methodologies you've been teaching to our Marines. Rebecca followed him to a quiet corner of the command post, aware that several personnel were watching the conversation with obvious interest. Corporal Martinez suffered injuries during an exercise that employed techniques you taught, Blackwood began. I need to understand your qualifications for developing and teaching these methods. The ricochet wasn't caused by training methods, Rebecca replied. It was caused by poor range safety planning. Someone should have identified that rock formation as a potential ricochet hazard before authorizing live fire exercises in that area. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting our range safety officers made an error? I'm suggesting that accidents happen when safety protocols don't account for all variables. The shooting position had nothing to do with the ricochet. Perhaps, but I still need to verify your qualifications for training military personnel. Can you provide documentation of your marksmanship instruction certification? The moment Rebecca had been dreading since her first day at Henderson Range had finally arrived. She could produce no certificates, no official credentials, no paperwork that would satisfy a military investigation. Her expertise was real, but her ability to prove it through official channels was non-existent. My qualifications speak for themselves, she said carefully. The Marines I've trained have shown measurable improvement in their shooting scores. Results don't validate methodology if the instructor lacks proper credentials, Blackwood replied. I'm going to need official documentation of your training background, certifications, and previous experience with military instruction. Before Rebecca could respond, Sergeant Major Torres interrupted. Major, I've got Corporal Martinez asking to speak with Ms. Hayes. Says it's important for the investigation. Martinez lay in the base medical facility, his right arm in a sling but his eyes alert and focused. Rebecca approached his bedside with a mixture of concern and apprehension. How are you feeling? She asked. Sore, but I'll live, Martinez replied. Ma'am, I need to tell you something. The accident wasn't caused by anything you taught us. I made a stupid mistake, got target-focused, and didn't properly assess my background. The ricochet was my fault, not yours. Rebecca felt a wave of relief mixed with professional pride. Martinez was taking responsibility rather than blaming the training, which spoke well of both his character and his understanding of what had actually occurred. Thank you for saying that, she said, but the investigation is going to focus on the training methods regardless. Martinez lowered his voice. Ma'am, there's something else. I've been thinking about yesterday's conversation, about the similarities between your teaching methods and what I saw at Fort Bragg. Rebecca's pulse quickened. What about it? I called a buddy of mine who's still at Bragg. Described some of the techniques you taught us. He said they sounded familiar, like methods used by a civilian contractor who worked with Special Forces about 10 years ago. Someone named Rebecca Chambers. The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her former identity, the career she'd walked away from, the expertise she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Martinez had connected the dots in a way that would be impossible to deny if the investigation went deeper. I don't know anyone by that name, Rebecca said quietly. Martinez studied her face with the intensity of someone trained to read people under stress. Ma'am, if that person was you, if you're the same instructor who trained special operations personnel, then what happened today makes a lot more sense. You're not just some librarian who happened to learn how to shoot. You're a professional who's been hiding in plain sight. Before Rebecca could respond, Major Blackwood appeared in the doorway. Miss Hayes, I need you to come with me. We've received some additional information that requires immediate clarification. As they walked back toward the command post, Rebecca realized that her carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling rapidly. The board meeting at the library, the investigation at the base, Martinez's growing suspicions. Everything was converging toward a revelation she'd spent 8 years trying to avoid. Ms. Hayes, Blackwood said as they entered his temporary office, I've been in contact with Fort Bragg regarding their civilian contractor records. It seems there was an instructor named Rebecca Chambers, who worked with Special Forces marksmanship training from 2012 to 2016, highly regarded, excellent results, then suddenly terminated her contract and disappeared from the defense contractor community. Rebecca remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only confirm what Blackwood had already deduced. The physical description matches, the teaching methodologies match, the expertise level certainly matches. Blackwood leaned back in his chair. So my question for you is simple. Are you Rebecca Chambers? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca could continue denying, but the evidence was mounting beyond her ability to deflect. More importantly, she was tired of running from who she used to be. Yes, she said quietly, I'm Rebecca Chambers. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. After 8 years of careful anonymity, she had voluntarily revealed the identity she'd worked so hard to escape. Blackwood nodded. unsurprised by her confession. Now we're getting somewhere. The next question is why Rebecca Chambers became Rebecca Hayes, and why one of the military's most respected civilian marksmanship instructors disappeared to work in a small-town library. Rebecca looked through the office window at the base activities continuing around them. Marines training, equipment being maintained, the routine operations of military readiness that had once been her professional world. That, she said, is a much longer story. Rebecca arrived at the Clearwater Public Library 30 minutes before the emergency board meeting, hoping to find some peace in the familiar surroundings before facing what might be her final confrontation with the life she'd built. The building felt different in the early morning light, smaller somehow, as if her expanded understanding of herself had shrunk the space that had once seemed like sanctuary. Base. She walked through the children's section where she'd spent countless hours organizing story times and helping young readers discover new worlds. The memory foam reading corner, the colorful alphabet displays, the carefully curated collection of picture books, all of it represented 8 years of careful anonymity and genuine service to the community. I thought I might find you here early. Rebecca turned to see Nancy Williams entering through the staff door, her expression weary but not unkind. The library director looked like she hadn't slept, her usually neat appearance slightly disheveled. Nancy, I owe you an explanation. Yes, you do, but maybe I owe you an apology too. Nancy settled into one of the small chairs designed for elementary school students, looking incongruous but somehow more approachable. I spent most of the night thinking about the past 8 years. About what kind of employee you've been, what kind of person you've shown yourself to be. Rebecca waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. You've never missed a day of work. Never caused problems with patrons, never complained about assignments, even the tedious ones. You've helped countless community members with research, taught computer skills to seniors, and made this library a better place through quiet dedication. Nancy paused, studying Rebecca's face. So when I balance that against whatever secrets you've been keeping, I find myself asking whether your past matters as much as your character. Before Rebecca could respond, the library's front door chimed. Board members began arriving for the reconvened meeting, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Robert Kellerman entered with a thick folder tucked under his arm, suggesting he'd spent considerable time researching Rebecca's background. We might as well get started, Kellerman announced without preamble. Ms. Hayes, or should I say Ms. Chambers, I think it's time for complete honesty. Rebecca took her seat facing the board, feeling the weight of scrutiny from 5 people who held her professional future in their hands. You're right. It's time for complete honesty. Over the next 20 minutes, Rebecca told them everything. Her background as a military contractor, the specialized training she'd provided to special forces, the tragic incident in Afghanistan that had driven her to abandon her career and construct a new identity. She spoke about the guilt that had consumed her, the therapy that had helped her function, and the 8 years of library work that had slowly rebuilt her sense of worth. The board listened in stunned silence, occasionally exchanging glances but asking no questions until she finished. So you've been living under a false identity for 8 years? Margaret Foster asked, her voice tight with disapproval. Legally changed identity, Rebecca corrected. Everything I did was through proper legal channels. I didn't commit fraud or deceive anyone about credentials I didn't possess. Dr. Patricia Hoffman leaned forward with professional interest. The psychological trauma you described, PTSD from the incident in Afghanistan, how has that affected your work here? It hasn't, Rebecca replied honestly. Working in the library provided the kind of structured, peaceful environment I needed to heal. Being helpful without the life and death consequences I'd lived with as a contractor. Kellerman opened his thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. I've been in contact with several sources overnight. The Department of Defense, former colleagues, background investigation services. Rebecca's stomach clenched, wondering what information he'd managed to uncover. According to my sources, Rebecca Chambers held the highest possible security clearances, worked on classified projects that cannot be discussed publicly, and was considered one of the most effective civilian marksmanship instructors in the military contractor community. He looked up from the documents. There's no evidence of criminal activity, ethical violations, or professional misconduct. The termination of your contracts appears to have been voluntary on your part. Then what's the problem? Asked board member James Riley, the youngest member and owner of the local hardware store. The problem, Foster interjected, is that we've had someone working with children and families who've been living under an assumed identity. How do we explain that to parents? How do we maintain community trust? By focusing on results rather than assumptions, Nancy said firmly. Rebecca has been an exemplary employee who's contributed enormously to this community. Her past doesn't change that. Kellerman held up a hand for silence. There's more. I received a call this morning from Colonel Patricia Hayes at the Pentagon. Apparently the military is very interested in reinstating Ms. Chambers as a contractor. They're offering a substantial consulting agreement. Rebecca felt the room's attention focus on her like a spotlight. They offered, but I haven't accepted. Why not? Dr. Hoffman asked with genuine curiosity. It sounds like an opportunity to return to work that utilized your full capabilities. The question struck at the heart of Rebecca's internal struggle. Because I'm not sure I'm ready to be that person again. The work I do here matters in a different way. It's constructive rather than potentially destructive. But you've been training Marines, Riley pointed out. That seems to bridge both worlds. Rebecca nodded, acknowledging the contradiction she'd been wrestling with since her conversation with Major Blackwood. The training has been different. Educational rather than operational, it feels safer, more controlled. Foster pulled out her own set of documents. I've been researching the legal implications of employing someone under a changed identity. While it's not illegal, it does create liability issues for the library district. What kind of liability issues? Nancy asked. Insurance complications, background check validity, potential legal challenges to employment decisions made without full knowledge of an employee's history. The room fell silent as the board members absorbed the complexity of the situation. Rebecca realized that her revelation had created problems extending far beyond her personal circumstances. I'll resign, she said quietly, effective immediately. That eliminates the liability issues and allows the library to move forward without complications. Absolutely not, Nancy said sharply. You're not resigning until we've fully explored all options. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Miss Chambers, let me ask you directly. If we were to continue your employment, would you be completely transparent about your background going forward? No more secrets? No more hidden expertise? Yes, Rebecca replied without hesitation. And would you be willing to use your expertise to benefit the community in appropriate ways? Perhaps developing educational programs, consulting on emergency preparedness, contributing skills that could serve the public good? The suggestion caught Rebecca off guard. She'd been so focused on hiding her capabilities that she'd never considered how they might be used constructively in a civilian context. I hadn't thought about that possibility. Think about it now, Dr. Hoffman said. We have a community member with extraordinary skills that could benefit local law enforcement, emergency responders, even educational programs for young people interested in STEM careers. Riley nodded enthusiastically. The regional high school has been looking for someone to help with their engineering and physics programs. Someone with your background could make a real difference. Rebecca felt a spark of possibility she hadn't experienced since her early days as a contractor. I'd be interested in exploring those options. Foster remained skeptical. What about the Pentagon offer? How do we know you won't just leave for more lucrative military work? Because I've learned something important working here, Rebecca replied. Money and prestige aren't the only measures of meaningful work. Helping a child discover the joy of reading, teaching an elderly person to use email, maintaining a community resource that serves everyone, that matters too. Nancy smiled for the first time since the crisis began. So you're saying you want to be both Rebecca Chambers and Rebecca Hayes? I'm saying I want to be myself completely, for the first time in 8 years. Someone who has specialized expertise but uses it in service of community rather than combat. Kellerman gathered his documents, his expression indicating a decision had been reached. I propose we table this discussion pending a community information meeting. Let the people of Clearwater know who you really are, what you've been doing with the Marines, and how your expertise might benefit the community going forward. A public meeting? Rebecca asked, feeling a familiar chill of anxiety. Complete transparency, Foster added. No more secrets, no more hidden identities. If you're going to continue working here, the community needs to know exactly who they're employing. The prospect of public exposure terrified Rebecca more than facing military investigators or hostile board members. Small-town gossip networks were more thorough than intelligence agencies and less forgiving of perceived deception. When? She asked. Tomorrow evening. Community Center, 7 p.m. We'll announce it through the usual channels. Newspaper, social media, word of mouth. As the board members prepared to leave, Nancy approached Rebecca with a supportive expression. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll stand with you at the meeting, and I'll make sure people understand the kind of employee and community member you've been." Rebecca felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by support she hadn't expected after 8 years of carefully maintained distance from meaningful relationships. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because 8 years ago you came to this library looking for a chance to start over. You've proven yourself worthy of that chance through your actions, not your secrets. Now it's time to see if this community is worthy of you." As Rebecca drove home that afternoon, she realized that tomorrow night would determine not just her employment status, but whether the integration of her two identities was possible in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. For 8 years, she'd successfully hidden Rebecca Chambers. Tomorrow, she would discover whether Clearwater was ready to embrace both versions of herself, or whether complete honesty would force her to start over once again. The quiet librarian's secret was about to become public knowledge, and there was no predicting how a small town would react to discovering they'd been harboring one of the military's most effective civilian instructors. The Clearwater Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this large since the heated school budget meetings of 2019. By 6:45 p.m., every folding chair was occupied, with dozens more people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Rebecca sat on the small stage, facing an ocean of familiar faces. Parents whose children she'd helped with homework, elderly patrons she'd taught to use computers, teenagers she'd guided toward college resources, and countless others whose lives had intersected with hers during 8 years of quiet service. Nancy Williams stood at the podium, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room despite the nervous energy crackling through the crowd. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We've called this meeting to address some recent developments regarding one of our library employees, and to discuss how those developments might affect our community going forward." Rebecca scanned the audience, noting the mixture of curiosity, concern, and genuine affection in the faces looking back at her. Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter Rebecca had helped prepare for science fair competitions. Jim Bradley, the veteran who'd struggled with VA paperwork until Rebecca spent hours helping him navigate the bureaucracy. Sarah Chen, the high school student who discovered her love of engineering through books Rebecca had recommended. "As many of you have heard through various channels," Nancy continued, "Rebecca Hayes has been assisting military personnel with specialized training over the past week. What you may not know is that Rebecca possesses expertise far beyond what her library position would suggest." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rebecca saw heads turning as neighbors shared whispered speculation about what kind of expertise could have attracted military attention to their quiet librarian. "Rather than allow rumors and speculation to fill in the gaps, we've decided that complete transparency is the best path forward. Rebecca has agreed to tell you her full story, who she was before coming to Clearwater, why she came here, and how her background might benefit our community in new ways." Nancy gestured toward Rebecca, who stood on unsteady legs and approached the podium. The sea of faces looked expectant, but not hostile, which gave her courage to begin. 8 years ago, I came to Clearwater running from a mistake that had cost an innocent person their life," Rebecca began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I thought the best thing I could do was hide my expertise, so it could never be used to hurt anyone again." She told them about Afghanistan, about the tragic miscalculation that had haunted her for nearly a decade. She explained her work as a military contractor, the specialized training she'd provided, and the psychological breakdown that had driven her to construct a new identity in rural Iowa. "I became Rebecca Hayes because I thought Rebecca Chambers was too dangerous to exist," she continued. "I took a job in your library because it seemed like the safest possible use of my time and energy, helping people find information instead of helping them use weapons." The room remained remarkably quiet, with even the standing crowd listening intently to her confession. "What I discovered over 8 years of working here is that helping people, whether it's finding the right book, learning new technology, or discovering educational opportunities, is just as important as any specialized skill I ever possessed. You taught me that service takes many forms, and that healing comes through contribution to something larger than yourself." Rebecca paused, gathering courage for what came next. "This week, circumstances forced me to use my old expertise to help train Marines. What I learned in the process is that my skills, when used appropriately, can still save lives and serve good purposes. The question now is whether it's possible to be both people, the expert and the librarian, the specialist and the community member. She looked directly at faces she recognized throughout the crowd. I'm asking for your trust. Not trust in who I used to be, but trust in who you've seen me become over 8 years of living and working among you. Margaret Foster, the real estate agent and library board member, stood from her seat in the front row. Rebecca, I'll be honest. I'm troubled by the deception involved in your identity change. But I'm more troubled by the thought of losing someone who's contributed so much to this community. Jim Bradley raised his hand from the middle section. Ma'am, if I may, I'm a 20-year Army veteran, and I know something about carrying guilt over things that weren't entirely your fault. What matters isn't the mistakes you've made, but what you've done since then to make amends. Several heads nodded in agreement. Mrs. Patterson called out from her seat near the back. Rebecca, you helped my granddaughter Sarah win that science fair 2 years ago. Spent hours working with her after the library closed. That kind of dedication doesn't come from someone with a dangerous character. Dr. Michael Harrison, the local pediatrician, stood to address the crowd. I've been thinking about this situation from a different angle. We have someone in our community with expertise that could benefit our volunteer fire department, our emergency medical services, maybe even our schools. Instead of focusing on what Rebecca was hiding, maybe we should focus on what she could contribute. The suggestion sparked animated discussion throughout the room. Rebecca heard fragments of conversation about emergency preparedness training, STEM education programs, and consulting for local law enforcement. Principal Janet Morrison from the high school raised her voice above the discussions. Rebecca, would you consider developing an advanced physics and engineering program for our students? We've been struggling to find qualified instructors for specialized STEM courses. I'd be honored to help with educational programs, Rebecca replied, feeling a spark of excitement about possibilities she'd never considered. Sergeant Torres, who had been sitting quietly near the back with several of his Marines, stood to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to offer a perspective from someone who's worked with Ms. Chambers professionally. Her training methods are among the most effective I've encountered in 20 years of military service. More importantly, her approach emphasizes responsibility, safety, and ethical application of technical skills. He looked directly at Rebecca. Ma'am, you've been carrying guilt over one tragic mistake while ignoring hundreds of positive outcomes from your expertise. The Marines you've trained this week aren't just better shooters. They're more thoughtful, more responsible, more aware of the consequences of their actions. Torres turned back to the crowd. If Clearwater is smart, you'll find ways to utilize Ms. Chambers' expertise while honoring the healing she's found in this community. Nancy returned to the podium, sensing the mood had shifted toward acceptance and curiosity rather than suspicion and anger. The library board has discussed several possibilities for moving forward, she announced. We'd like to propose that Rebecca continue her library duties while also developing community education programs that utilize her expertise appropriately. She outlined ideas that had emerged from the board's discussions: emergency preparedness workshops for local first responders, advanced STEM programs for area schools, consulting for regional law enforcement agencies, and educational seminars for responsible firearms ownership. Additionally, Nancy continued, the Pentagon has offered Rebecca a part-time consulting agreement that would allow her to contribute to military training while maintaining her roots in Clearwater. This would bring federal training contracts to our area, creating economic benefits for the entire region. Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the support and creative thinking her revelation had inspired. Instead of rejection and suspicion, the community was actively seeking ways to integrate her expertise into beneficial local programs. There's one more thing, she said, returning to the microphone. I want to establish a scholarship fund for local students pursuing STEM careers, particularly those from families who couldn't otherwise afford advanced education. It's a way to honor the memory of the young person whose death drove me here, while helping ensure that technical expertise is always used in service of positive outcomes. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. Rebecca looked out at faces that had transformed from curious to supportive, from suspicious to enthusiastic. Dr. Harrison approached the stage as the formal meeting concluded. Rebecca, I'd like to discuss incorporating emergency medical training into your proposed programs. Your precision and attention to detail could be invaluable in teaching trauma response techniques. Principal Morrison was right behind him. "And I want to talk about that advanced physics program. Our students deserve exposure to real-world applications of theoretical knowledge." As the crowd began to disperse, Rebecca found herself surrounded by community members offering ideas, support, and friendship. The isolation she'd maintained for 8 years was dissolving into something she'd never expected to find again: belonging. Nancy appeared at her side, smiling broadly. "So how does it feel to be yourself completely for the first time in 8 years?" Rebecca looked around at her adopted community, people who had just learned she'd been living under a changed identity but were more interested in her future contributions than her past deceptions. "It feels like coming home," she replied, "not to a place, but to myself." 6 months later, Rebecca stood before a different kind of audience. The newly constructed Clearwater Center for Applied Learning buzzed with activity as local high school students, military personnel, and community members participated in various educational programs she had developed. Her business cards now read Rebecca Chambers Hayes, Director of Specialized Education, reflecting the integration of both her identities into a role that honored her past while serving her community's future. The Scholarship Fund had awarded its first grants to 3 local students pursuing engineering degrees. The Emergency Preparedness Program had trained 50 local first responders in advanced techniques. The Pentagon Consulting Agreement had brought federal training contracts worth over $2 million to the regional economy. But the moment that brought Rebecca the most satisfaction came during a quiet afternoon in the original library, where she still spent 2 days a week helping patrons with research and reading recommendations. A young girl approached the reference desk with a science project about ballistics and trajectory calculation. "Ms. Rebecca," the girl said, "my teacher says you're the smartest person in town about physics and math. Can you help me understand how bullets fly through the air?" Rebecca smiled, remembering her own childhood fascination with the mathematics of motion that had eventually led to both her greatest professional achievements and her most painful mistake. "I'd be happy to help," she replied, pulling out a clean sheet of paper. "But first, let's talk about why understanding physics is important, and how knowledge becomes truly valuable only when it's used to help people." As she began sketching diagrams and explaining concepts, Rebecca realized that her journey from military contractor to hidden librarian to community educator hadn't been about running from her expertise. It had been about learning to use it wisely. The quiet librarian's secret had become the foundation for a life that honored both precision and compassion, both technical excellence and community service. In the end, she discovered that the most important shot she'd ever taken was the chance to rebuild herself, one day at a time, in a small town that had been willing to see her potential rather than just her past. Some stories don't end with dramatic victories or crushing defeats. Sometimes they end with the simple recognition that healing comes through service, that expertise finds its highest purpose in education, and that the most profound transformations happen not in moments of crisis, but in the quiet accumulation of trust, contribution, and belonging. Rebecca Chambers Hayes had finally learned to aim for the target that mattered most, a life lived authentically in service of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.